Hello, you're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Rafael Khachaturian. With us today is Samuel Moyn. Professor Moyn is the Henry R. Lucci Professor of Jurisprudence and Professor of History at Yale University. He's the author and co-editor of numerous books and articles in the fields of international law and the history of modern political and legal thought. Among his most recent books are The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History in 2010, Human Rights and the Uses of History in 2014, Christian Human Rights in 2015, and most recently, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World in 2018. He's also a prolific contributor to a variety of public intellectual venues, including the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New Republic, The Nation, the New York Times, and Dissent, among others. Professor Moyn, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful.
I'd like to begin by taking stock of where we stand today in the beginning of the 2020s. So over the last few years, many scholars and public intellectuals have written about this being a period of crisis. Some would call it a quote unquote crisis of liberal democracy. Others call it a crisis of neoliberalism, and so on. But in general, there seems to be a consensus that we are living through quite tumultuous times for democracy and democratic politics. You of course, have contributed to these discussions with your own public interventions in some of the venues that I just mentioned. What would be your own general perspective on the state of democracy and democratic politics in this current juncture?
It's a great question, and I think there's a kind of wide-ranging debate about how to answer it. And I've mainly worried about homogenizing different places with all their specificities, as if there were just one syndrome. Although it's true that different places, especially across the North Atlantic, share some significant features. I think my main claim has been that in a sense there was always a crisis. Democracy, if you like, is founded on a crisis of the difficulty of representing the people. And our contemporary moment, it seems as if it's led a lot of people to not overstate, but wrongly state how new the crisis is, at least in the United States. Really, if we look across the so-called populist countries, including in the global South, like India, only in very few, like the Philippines, do we see a kind of slide into outright authoritarianism. And so I've wanted to, let's say, take a check before we embrace the fear that democracy is dying, it's on the brink of fascism and tyranny, not because there are no problems, but because the problems are longstanding, especially for, significant classes of victims. And what I've tried to argue, along with lots of others, is that the economic has been a big feature, and the inequality or neoliberal crisis or feature of the crisis is by no means new in 2016 or even a few years before, but we're really seeing the consequences of very long-term choices, whether in economics or in the America's war posture after 1989.
And I want to get to the topic of the economic crisis in relationship to democracy in a moment. But I also, because this has been such a concern of yours in some of your recent writing, for example, in your most recent book, Not Enough, you write, to quote you, that human rights have become prisoners of the contemporary age of inequality. So inequality is something that you've been thinking about a lot lately. And you spend the rest of the book kind of explaining how this came to be. But before we get to this background, can you tell us a little bit about where human rights actually stand today? So how is today, if in any ways different from the 1990s and 2000s, when the discourse of human rights was, in a way, the lingua franca of international politics?
Well, it is a fascinating moment that's clearly quite different. I'd say mainly in the level of enthusiasm, or really millennial enthusiasm around human rights. And um, I think we're seeing a kind of double depression. So let me explain what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 1990s, when I was a young man, human rights were, let's say, all the rage, not just as things that were getting institutionalized, but almost as the morality at the end of history. All that was left was to spread the gospel, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And fair enough, because human rights do refer to some crucial values, whether just civil liberties or even um, economic and social rights that began to be pursued, right to health care or water or sanitation um,
Mm-hmm.
in some places. But what's happened since, I think, is that we've noticed something that was missed in the 1990s, which was that the United States in particular, but really Western governments in general, and beyond Western governments, were committing to a new kind of economically neoliberal governance, and that has made this faith around human rights and the desire to promote them companions, at least chronologically, of the victory of neoliberal policies, which has meant expanding inequality in many places. And so the
Mm-hmm.
book is really an attempt to reckon with that coincidence and think about it. I'd say the double depression that set in is, first, that there's been a backlash and lots of parties and politicians that reject human rights,
Mm-hmm.
or seem to do so, because of course Donald Trump, Secretary of State, has set up his whole commission on unalienable rights, championing them while revisiting them.
Right.
But it seems to the rest of us like there's this moment of backlash and pushback. Um, but I think there's a deeper depression, which is that it seemed at one point as if we were on the verge of kind of, um, you know, definitive answers about how to frame our expectations about the good life,
Mm-hmm.
and and the plan didn't work out, and so I think people are confused and groping, um, having realized that human rights are not the morality of the end of history, because there's no end of history.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as the title of your book suggests, and as you were just saying, human rights have fallen short of being able to articulate the need for material equality. So while they may have been beneficial in some instances, and there was a moment when you could say that human rights were somewhat the telos of history, and despite the past success that they've actually had, especially after the 1970s, it still seems like something is lacking. So what is it about human rights that makes them insufficient for actually making claims about equality? And here I'm wondering if this is a problem that we could say is inherent to the language of human rights itself and to the way that human rights have been constructed in terms of what they actually can and can't be used to advocate? Or is this more of a problem of a time and place, that human rights were swept up in the broader social transformations that we've experienced since the 1970s, in which, for which they have not been able to actually articulate any kind of material equality?
Mm-hmm. So, what I wanted to kind of spark was a debate about that question. And, I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you what my side is, but, I also ought to tell you what other people have said.
Mm-hmm.
So I just would begin by saying that um, human rights um, were never intended, even on paper, to advance distributive equality. I do talk in the book about another dimension of equality that I call status equality. And human rights are very much connected to the proposition that no one should be treated differently because of the kind of person they are, what race they are belong to, or what gender they have, or sexual orientation, or indigenous background. But distributive or material equality is really not mentioned as a human right or a goal of human rights. Now, we could say that especially the economic and social rights that are in various treaties should relate to or have the effect of increasing material equality or more of it. But that would be a kind of indirect commitment, and would really have to check and find out if in fact the advancement of human rights was a kind of indirect recipe for more distributive or material inequality. So I'd say the problem, if it is one, is that it's human rights are selective. They identify some moral concerns, but leave distributive inequality out as a moral concern. And you could have a couple of responses to that, proposition. One is that it's correct to leave out material inequality because it's not wrong. If human rights are vindicated, especially these basic rights to what I call sufficient provision, like everyone getting enough healthcare and water and sanitation, it doesn't matter if there's inequality left over. Or you could say it's someone else's problem. And I think that is a plausible answer, that second one. But then, the audiences for human rights should want that someone else to, come into existence. And my work is basically about arguing that we should keep human rights for what they're good for, but also keep them in their place and demand other ideals and agents to advance those ideals. Now, in response to my claims, some have said that human rights are about material equality too, even if they're not, they don't kind of say so. Some have even argued that human rights have made the world more materially equal, or kept it from becoming less materially unequal. I don't see lots of evidence for either of these propositions. As you say, as your question, I think rightly suggests, human rights have gotten institutionalized since the 70s or 1990s, whenever you want to start the story, amidst galloping inequality. So we should conclude from this that they're selective, or they're not good at advancing egalitarian aims, and then have a debate about what the consequence of that fact is.
And of course, the one of the reasons why then you focus on the idea of social rights as a counterpart to human rights is because, in your account, social rights provide us with something that human rights can't fulfill on their own. So what would you say is the relationship between human rights and social rights? In what ways do social rights differ from human rights? And then do you see them as being in tension with each other, or more as necessary conditions or preconditions for the other to be successful?
So, I'd say that it depends on how we define our terms. I definitely am interested in the book, among other things, in just giving a history, because I don't know of one, of the notion of economic and social rights, or just plain social rights in modern history. And I try to do that, and what that means is showing how differently people have understood what they are and what work they're going to get done. I think that in recent history, especially since 1989, it's only fair to note that even very mainstream human rights organizations have made economic and social rights central to what they monitor and the politics they pursue. But what I try to argue is that even when that's happened, economic and social rights have been in the guise of sufficient provision. What they're out to secure is some threshold entitlement that
Mhm.
individuals are supposed to have to various, decencies of life. Now, there's another, let's say, slightly different, maybe rival notion of economic and social rights that's older than what we call human rights, especially international human rights. And I have in mind labor rights.
Mhm.
So, the labor movements and socialist parties back in the day fought sometimes for like workplace health and safety and weekends off and limitations to working hours, but the right they really cared most about was the right to organize and agitate,
Mhm.
because they understood rights to be part of their campaign to build power to challenge um, the those who control the economy and get a better, including a more equal deal for themselves. So that's I think the place where social rights have differed a lot in history from what human rights have come to mean today, because they
Mhm.
were once connected to a kind of egalitarian goal because they were about empowering the working class. Um, Human rights today are about providing sufficient amounts of the decencies of life to the worst off, and that's just a different agenda. It's noble, but it's not the only one there is.
Mhm. And if we turn a little bit now to the history of the rise of social rights, one part of the story that figures prominently in your narrative is the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You note that this declaration helped cement the idea of social rights as requiring some degree of distributional equality. What did this balance between social rights and human rights entail in the post-war moment specifically? And can we say, in retrospect, what was it that the Universal Declaration accomplished, looking back on it now?
So, about 10 years ago, I wrote an earlier book about the history of human rights, and mainly I wanted to kind of make a negative point about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the United Nations propounded in December 1948. Because what struck me then is how few people seemed to notice it,
Mhm.
and how it didn't give rise to what we think of as human rights politics, including human rights law and transnational human rights movements. So in the new book, I kind of take a second look at that era, and in a way accuse myself of having missed the point, because
Mhm.
I was looking for something um, in the 1940s like too early to find it. And
Mhm.
when we go back and put the Universal Declaration in the politics of the 1940s, I think it turns out to have been something like a charter for the national welfare states that were becoming like the highest goals across the Atlantic. Also, the highest goal of movements, just not non-governmental organizations of the kinds we think, but rather trade unions and the socialist parties that were, sometimes getting into power.
Mhm.
Um, the implication is that while the Universal Declaration doesn't again mention um, any distributive equality as a goal, the fact that it includes economic and social rights, I think, reflects a one-time belief in the 1940s that the point of states is to create the good life for their citizens,
Mhm.
and this will involve some sufficient provision, but it will also involve, you know, more equality um, distributionally than before, or in our case, since. And so, what I want to do is kind of reclaim not so much the Universal Declaration as the era of the welfare state, as one that in spite of some very big flaws, which we can talk about,
Mhm.
still did feature the goal and the achievement of distributive equality more than any other era of modern history.
Mhm. And to pivot a little bit now to
Mhm.
some of the flaws that you just mentioned, the welfare states of the global north during this period were had serious internal contradictions. It seems that uh, it wouldn't be fair to say that the achievement of social rights was premised on exclusions that were both internal, as in the case of, let's say, women and minority groups within those states in the global north, and also external in the sense that the nations of the global south were not integrated into that kind of network of distributional equality.
Oh, it's completely fair. And I think it would be wrong to be nostalgic in any way for these welfare states. I think precisely for the reason you're mentioning. So
Mhm.
across the Atlantic, um, there were these new welfare states, but they organized fairness around the male breadwinner and women and children only so far as they were attached to that male breadwinner, typically an industrial worker.
Mhm.
And that meant, exclusion of almost universally of women from the kind of status equality that we've tried to provide, and that feminists have sought, and to an extraordinary extent in the global north won. Um, the global picture, I think, is in a sense even worse, because the amazing fact is that welfare states were established in between the 1930s and 1950s in so few places, almost all in the global north.
Mhm.
In 1948, at the time of the Universal Declaration, there were 50 odd states that existed to vote on it, and now we have 200. And what that meant is that many of the states that did, embrace human rights and egalitarian welfare uh, at home were still running big empires, and
Mhm.
there was no distributional project that was accorded to imperial subjects. So even though white males at home in the global north got some sufficient provision and distributional equality, colonial subjects did not get either. And so it was no wonder that they sought decolonization and a kind of globalization of the welfare state in the subsequent period.
Mhm. And if we can now sort of turn to the mid to late 1970s as a critical period for when things started to change. In some ways, you note that the language of human rights began its upswing right around the time that the language of socialism was beginning to decline. So I have a kind of two-part question here. One is, what role did the actual existence of socialist states play in facilitating the Western capitalist states to actually uh, accept some kind of notion of distributional equality? And then what happened after the 70s that allowed human rights to kind of become dislodged from the national framework that they were embedded in and then become transnationalized?
So this is, I think, the kind of pivotal moment to reflect on and try to understand, and really, for both the reasons that you're you know you're raising. You might think of it in the following terms. You had, people that in the 1940s, coming out of World War II, committed themselves to modes of national justice, including egalitarian justice. And of course, this is the period when socialism is at its height, not just behind the Iron Curtain, but globally. You think of a state like the state of Israel, founded, the very moment that the Universal Declaration is propounded.
Mm-hmm.
And, the kind of amazing thing we should never forget is that it's founded by people we could call national socialists, small n, small s,
Mm-hmm.
obviously. So they exclude lots of people, notably Palestinians, but for Israel, what they want is a state for Jews that is socialistic, and that reflected kind of an incredibly broad ideal, wherever there was, enough kind of industrial modernity to have these ideals and kind of the abundance that could allow for these egalitarian movements. What happens in the 70s is, if you like, even as the social contract at home is fraying and socialism is being abandoned, especially in kind of capitalist countries, there's a kind of extension of the gaze outward, and and in a way it was noble, because the kind of nationalist imaginary that prevailed in the middle of the 20th century, even if it was socialistic, was not about building a just world. And so you have a lot of folks who redefine idealism in terms of human rights, which now are much less connected to a project of domestic social justice and more connected to a minimalist project of international justice. It has no distributional component, but it is a kind of cosmopolitan program of providing civil liberties globally. And it's a kind of momentous choice. You can think about it as an expansion and a contraction of the project that had existed before. And I think we have to note both sides of it to understand why it was so exciting to people to move beyond the nationalist moment to a more cosmopolitan one. But maybe what was missed, even by actors themselves, is that contraction. These are the folks who make the Universal Declaration famous for the first time, but it's as if it's just the first half of the Declaration without the second half with economic and social rights, let alone the kind of egalitarian program that had given the Universal Declaration meaning in its own time.
And you open your book with a kind of account of Zdena Tominova as a key member of Charter 77, this group of dissident intellectuals in the Eastern Bloc who you argue still tried to retain a kind of more holistic understanding of the way that human rights and social rights were related and integrated with each other.
Right. So it was imaginable to say that human rights should retain their links not just to social rights but to an even more ambitious egalitarian program. It's just that possibility, which was hypothetical, didn't win out in practice, as Western organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch just ignored distribution, and big countries like ours, the United States, found a human rights diplomacy, but it's very narrowly focused on civil liberties.
And then you spend a substantial amount of time in the book arguing that human rights discourse overlapped with the emergence of neoliberalism during this period, but that the relationship between them is rather complicated. So you're pretty critical of accounts that claim that human rights are simply a smokescreen or an instrumental cover for neoliberal economic policies. So then how should we think about the relationship between neoliberalism and human rights? And here I'm wondering if, rather than saying that neoliberalism directly caused the spread of human rights, that it might be more accurate to say that there was something like an elective affinity between the two. So human rights were a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the hegemony that neoliberalism was able to achieve by the 1980s.
Right. So It's a great question, and really, once again, in my contribution, I just wanted to kind of start a debate, and it's gone on, um,
Mhm.
and it will go on, and a lot of exciting possibilities are available. Um, so, if we're going to start kind of detailing the reasons why political economy changed in the 70s, and um, and neoliberalism, if that's what we want to call it, prevailed. I don't think human rights is near the top of the list, and it's not clear what we gain by insisting that it's somewhere down at the bottom.
Mhm.
um, it's human rights are part of the world that neoliberalism brought about, but it seems not the most important thing critically to attack or blame human rights for being a big causal factor. I do think, kind of, however, that we need to think very seriously about what it tells us about human rights that they um, they're part of the neoliberal ecology that was set up. And the way I would just put it very briefly is that some things in the neoliberal jungle couldn't survive. They were powerful opposition to the predator of neoliberalism, and they were killed off. And I have in mind, of course, socialism as the most obvious, including the agents of egalitarian justice like trade unions, which have been in steep decline,
Mhm.
and socialist parties, which have themselves transformed in a neoliberal direction. Um, on the other hand, human rights not only survive but thrive, but especially as ideals, as things people want to pursue, and people adopt as their creed in life. Good people. And so my theory is that human rights could survive in this jungle because they weren't a serious threat to neoliberalism.
Mhm.
If you like, they were the butterfly flitting around. They prettify the jungle,
Hmm.
but the super predator out there that's killed off all of its real competition might, like it, or that butterfly flitting around. It makes its dominance prettier. Uh, and if you want to be generous to human rights, which I do, you can say, well, look, they're doing all these important things. It's just they're not the right challenger for the really dangerous predator that's lurking around the jungle. And
Mhm.
precisely because they were kind of um, the things that human rights has been trying to advance were not deeply threatening to
Mhm.
the neoliberal transformation of political economy.
Mhm. And then to begin to wrap up, I'm wondering if we can speculate a little bit and look forward to the question of whether it's possible to re-embed human rights within social rights, or maybe to put it differently, to link and re-articulate them together again. I'm wondering if you have any present day tendencies that you have observed that we could say would make this possible. For my own perspective, I thought that something like the need to address the ecological crisis could be one imperative for recovering
Hmm.
social rights on a transnational
Hmm.
level. So I
Hmm.
bring this up because it might be a framework that allows us to think of human rights and social rights as mutually reinforcing. So the threat of ecological unraveling uh, necessitates both one and the other. And I'm also thinking of some of the attempts to codify the language of rights as necessary for the preservation of biospheres in nations like Ecuador and Bolivia, among others.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if you think that this could be a way forward, or perhaps some other tendencies that you've observed.
It's really an all important question for those who care about human rights. I mean, I've basically said we should, in a sense, look elsewhere. We should keep human rights around. We should keep that hammer in the toolbox for when we have a nail. But since there are a lot of other projects that are not about hammers and nails. We just need to create other tools and rely on them. One of these would be a kind of egalitarian project that might require a totally different tool than a human rights, agenda. So that's my basic conclusion, and it's kind of to leave room for kind of better progressive candidates, a new version of progressive parties and movements that are not only dedicated to human rights, but also egalitarian justice. What I think you're raising is this really fascinating possibility that the ecological crisis could provide a kind of new setting in which to think about this kind of shift in agenda. One of the thinkers I like has coined the notion of the reformism of fear. And he really did so to think about the Great Depression and responses to it. And, the idea is that the reason why the wealthy were once willing to entertain high taxes and more fair social compacts was that they felt that if they didn't, they would face even worse results, and so they were pressured and given kind of enough anxiety to lead them to live not separate lives but amongst the rest of us in a kind of social situation. And maybe you could think about the ecological crisis as an equal or even bigger threat to the kinds of outcomes that people feared in the past, and which immobilized them into making crucial reform. So I won't comment on the specific examples you raised, which are worth a lot of reflection. But I just would say my general idea would be to think about the environmental catastrophe as something that could help us raise consciousness about social justice in general, and maybe incentivize different choices than have prevailed lately.
Well, Professor Moyn, I want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm very grateful.
This has been the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Rafael Khachaturian, and until next time.